now I see.
This street runs along the western wall of the Temple Mount. In Jesus' day, these booths were filled with merchants and money changers. Some say it's the place where he fulfilled yet another prophecy.
Malachi the prophet said the Lord himself would come to the second temple. There would be a divine visitation, and God would come and purify and cleanse the religious system. Jesus, the divine Messiah, visits the temple. He fulfills what had to happen before the second temple was destroyed.
Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, speaking the words of the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah. My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves.
If we rightly understand the Hebrew Bible, either Jesus is our Messiah or there can never be a Messiah. The Messianic era had to begin before the second temple was destroyed. Otherwise, there can be no redemption.
Jesus himself predicted the destruction of the temple. Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. The chief priests saw Jesus' words as a threat. From then on, they planned to kill him, and they got help from one of his disciples.
We will never know what was going on in the mind of Judas Iscariot. We do know that in the minds of Jesus' followers, this was a great betrayal.
On the night before Passover, Jesus and his disciples gathered one last time to celebrate the Seder.
At the Last Supper, we understand that Jesus is preparing the disciples for the trauma that is about to unfold. He says, now let me tell you what it means to be the Messiah. I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be mocked and beaten, and I'm going to be put to death, and on the third day I will rise again.
During the meal, Jesus handed Judas a piece of bread, identifying the one who would betray him, a signal David had prophesied in the Psalms. My own familiar friend, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. The chief priests paid Judas 30 pieces of silver to hand over Jesus, the price of a common slave. Overcome by guilt, Judas later tried to give back the money. The priests refused, so Judas threw the silver on the floor of the temple, then went out and killed himself. With the blood money, they bought this potter's field. Tradition says this is where Judas hanged himself, and today it's still known as the Field of Blood. 500 years earlier, Zechariah had predicted the price on Jesus' head, as well as the act of Judas, throwing the money into the house of the Lord to the potter. While Judas carried out his betrayal, the rest of the disciples finished the Passover meal. They sang a hymn called The Great Praise, or Hallel in Hebrew. The words written by King David 1,000 years earlier took on new meaning as Jesus headed closer to the cross. Bind the sacrifice with cords to the horns of the altar. This is the psalm that Jesus sang after he lifted up the cup of the new covenant in his blood. I will take up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord. I shall not die, but live and declare the works of the Lord. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Then they sang the same words the crowds had shouted a few days earlier when Jesus entered Jerusalem. Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
Every year at Easter, Christians from around the world flood the streets of Jerusalem to follow Jesus' final steps to the cross. But as you're about to see, those steps may not be exactly where you think.
Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. Tradition says this is the street where Jesus took his last steps on earth.
For centuries, Christians have walked the Via Dolorosa to retrace the journey to the cross. But are they walking in the right direction?
From an archaeological perspective, what might have been the steps on Jesus' last journey from the Mount of Olives to Pilate and to his crucifixion, a new suggested itinerary is emerging.
The Gospels tell us that Jesus spent his last night here on the Mount of Olives, in the Garden of Gethsemane. Here Judas betrayed him, and the temple guard arrested him. They led Jesus down through the Kidron Valley and up to Mount Zion, to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. This is the road they would have taken.
How do you know from an archaeological standpoint that this is the road that Jesus walked down?
Since it was a main street and it leads down the Kidron Valley and up to the Mount of Olives, it's a very good candidate for Jesus to have taken that path.
This church was built on the ruins of the house of the high priest. Under the house is a cistern, the prison where Jesus may have been held the night before he died.
And it's a very interesting room. It's a cistern. It's carved out of the rock and made into a place that you can store water. But in this case, a prisoner could be lowered through that opening and would have no way of escape. It makes us think of the psalm where David writes, "O Lord, I've been cast into the pit with no way of escape."
The next morning, Jesus was taken to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. This is where archaeology takes a detour from tradition.
The real archaeology of Jerusalem began in a serious way from 67 on. And that means for the last 40 years, there's been the opportunity to really get down to first century Jerusalem and to find out where things lay in that city at the time of Jesus.
This is Station 2 of the Way of the Cross. In Jesus' day, the Antonia Fortress stood here, the headquarters for the Roman army. Tradition says this was the place where Pilate put Jesus on trial. Archaeologists say tradition is wrong.
We know that Roman soldiers were encamped in that area of the Antonia Fortress. The northwest corner of the city was a garrison for Roman soldiers who were keeping peace and watch over the Temple Mount. But of course, the governor doesn't live in the garrison with the soldiers. The governor lives in the palace with the gardens.
That palace was half a mile away, on the western side of the city. Under this tower are the remains of King Herod's palace. When Pilate came to Jerusalem, this is where he stayed. Just outside the tower wall is an ancient stone platform. Archaeologists say this was the judgment seat where Jesus was tried.
The palace of Pontius Pilate and the palace of Herod lay behind this wall. So this is really the most likely candidate for Jesus having come from the south, outside of the city wall, to his trial.
This is where Pilate washed his hands and made his famous statement, "Behold the man." Scholars may disagree on the path Jesus took, but most agree that his final steps lead here, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Roman Emperor Constantine built the church in 335 to mark the site of Jesus' death and burial. And it's one spot where archaeology and tradition agree.
Helena, the mother of Constantine, did go around and she interviewed Christians who were living here to find out what their memories were, the historic memories that the local church preserved. She finds this spot, which the